The story of the talking donkey and Balaam is found in the book of Numbers in the Bible, specifically in Numbers 22:21-35. It is an intriguing account that teaches us important lessons about listening to God's voice, the dangers of stubbornness, and the sovereignty of God. The story begins with the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, and Balak, the king of Moab, becoming fearful of their presence. Balak decided to hire a diviner named Balaam to curse the Israelites, hoping that it would weaken them. Balaam was initially hesitant to go, as God had warned him not to curse the Israelites since they were blessed by him. However, Balak persisted and sent messengers to persuade Balaam to come. In verse 21, we find Balaam setting out on his journey with his donkey. However, an angel of the Lord stood in Balaam's path, though he couldn't see the angel. The donkey, being sensitive to the angel's presence, veered off the road into a field. Balaam, frustrated with the donkey's behavior, struck it to get it back on the road. This happened 2 more times, with the donkey avoiding the angel's presence, and each time Balaam became more angry and struck the animal. Finally, in verse 28, the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam, seemingly unfazed by the talking donkey, responds to the animal as if it were a normal conversation. Then, the Lord opens Balaam's eyes, and he sees the angel standing before him, with a drawn sword. The angel rebukes Balaam for his mistreatment of the donkey and tells him to only speak the words that God puts in his mouth. The story continues with Balaam meeting with Balak and speaking blessings over Israel instead of curses, as God directed him. This frustrates Balak, but Balaam affirms that he can only say what God allows him to say. This story teaches us several important lessons. God can use unconventional means to get our attention. In this story, God used a talking donkey to speak to Balaam. It reminds us that God can use unexpected methods or even unusual circumstances to communicate with us. We should be open and attentive, not limiting God to only specific ways of speaking to us. God's sovereignty overrules human intentions. Balak sought to use Balaam to curse the Israelites, but God's sovereignty prevailed. Balaam could only speak the words God allowed him to speak, which turned into blessings for Israel. It teaches us that ultimately, God's plans and purposes will prevail over the intentions of humans. We should submit to God's will and trust in His sovereignty. The danger of stubbornness and pride. Balaam's stubbornness is evident throughout the story. Even after the donkey spoke to him, he didn't pause to reflect on why it happened but continued on his journey. Balaam's stubbornness almost led to his own destruction. It serves as a warning for us to avoid pride and stubbornness in our own lives. We should be willing to listen and yield to God's leading, even when it contradicts our own desires or plans. The importance of listening to God's voice. Balaam's encounter with the angel reminded him of the need to speak only what God commanded him to say. It emphasizes the significance of listening to and obeying God's voice in our lives. God's guidance and instructions should always take precedence over our own. Certainly. Here are a few more lessons we can glean from the story of the talking donkey and Balaam. Animal communication. The miraculous aspect of the story is the donkey's ability to speak. It demonstrates that God has the power to enable even the most unexpected creatures to communicate His message. It reminds us that God's creation is under His control, and He can use any means necessary to convey His will. God's concern for His creation. The fact that God intervened on behalf of the donkey and rebuked Balaam for mistreating it shows His care for all His creatures. It teaches us to treat animals with kindness and respect, acknowledging our responsibility as stewards of God's creation. Trusting God's protection. Despite Balaam's encounter with the angel, he continued on his journey. This shows a lack of trust in God's protection. We learn the importance of trusting in God's guidance and relying on His providence. When God warns us or redirects our path, we should listen and trust that He is leading us in the right direction. Integrity in our words and actions. Balaam's initial hesitation to go against God's command is commendable. However, his eventual willingness to continue with the journey despite God's disapproval reveals a lack of integrity. It serves as a reminder for us to uphold moral and ethical principles in our words and actions, even when faced with tempting opportunities or pressures. God's grace and mercy. Despite Balaam's disobedience, God did not abandon him. Instead, He allowed Balaam to continue his journey and work within the boundaries of His will. It reflects God's grace and mercy towards us, even when we make mistakes or exhibit stubbornness. We should be grateful for God's patience and seek repentance when we go astray. The limitations of divination and human manipulation. Balaam was initially sought out for his divination skills, with the hope that his curses could harm the Israelites. However, Balaam's experience reveals the limitations of human power and manipulation. It reminds us that our trust should ultimately be placed in God, who holds ultimate authority and control over all things. Overall, the story of the talking donkey and Balaam reminds us of the importance of obedience, humility, trust, and integrity in our relationship with God. It encourages us to listen attentively to God's voice, be open to His guidance, and align our will with His. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe to my channel.